All right. There we go. Okay, well, thank you, Greg. My job tonight is to explain the history and the nature of the American Employee Stock Ownership Plan. And the plan we're designed for Slovenia uses many of the basic ideas and makes a few improvements. So that's my job, is to explain that tonight. So first of all, much older than the ESOP. ESOP started in about the late 1970s, early 80s, it really got going. But much earlier than that, you had these employee share purchase plans, and they're quite different. And so the first difference is that employee share purchase plans are individual ownership. And in general, the employees can sell the shares to anybody else or whatever, whereas the ESOP is a separate legal entity where all the employee shares are in that legal entity, which in the American case is a trust. The employees have individual accounts in the trust, so they will get the appreciation on the shares, but they can't sell them separately. They can't, if somebody makes a takeover bid for a company, then the employees cannot individually sell them. So that's one big difference. Another difference here is that everybody's included in an ESOP, that all employees are automatically included. It's an employee benefit, and it's not something where you have to buy your way in. And with employee share purchase plans, typically what happened is that the employees that have more discretionary funds, white collar managerial employees, would take advantage of it, and the blue collar employees, other lower paid workers, would not. So it wasn't a good way to build up an ownership culture in the company if you had a major division between workers that had shares and workers that didn't. So the ESOP gets around that. The ESOP includes everybody. The third big difference here is that the ESOP, it's financed by either a lender or just seller credit when you have a retiring owner or a partner or founder that wants out of the company and wants to get cashed out. Then they may sign a note to turn over shares to the ESOP, and then the ESOP pays them off over a period of time. But the contributions to the ESOP in the American case are like pension contributions. So they're contributions from the company to the ESOP as a separate legal entity, as a trust, and then the money is passed through to pay off the note. And so there are a number of tax advantages as well, because when you pay, a company pays into a pension plan, the entire payment is tax deductible from corporate income tax. Whereas normally when you pay off a loan, it's only the interest that's deductible. So you have a tax break there. And there are a number of other tax breaks in the American case that we can talk about. And the other thing is, it's not being paid for individually by the workers. So it's a collective contribution by the company to the ESOP instead of a payroll deduction. So everybody's involved, and the company pays it off with these tax favored payments. So the inventor of the idea, as I mentioned, the idea really got going in the late 1970s, is Louis Kelso, who was a lawyer. And you can see from the names of his books the sort of ideological orientation. This was not a left-wing thing, this was a right-wing thing in America. He had a book called The Capitalist Manifesto, or How to Turn 80 Million Workers into Capitalist on Borrowed Money. So this is an idea that came out of the right-wing or conservative tradition in America. Kelso famously said that the main problem with capitalism is that there are not enough capitalists. And so he devised this plan to automatically bring the employees in a company into ownership of shares through the ESOP. So the idea came out of this experience in America with leveraged buyouts. This was a big rage in the late 60s, the early 70s. And what are today called private equity firms would borrow money, generally buy out a company, and then restructure the company, make it, supposedly, this was the theory, make it more efficient. And then the company would, in effect, itself pay off the debt. So the company was like buying itself, but the equity firm would still own it. So Kelso said, why don't we do that, but have it so that the employees end up being the owners? And so that was where the idea of the ESOP came about, that you take out a loan or you use seller credit, and then the company becomes more efficient if you integrate the employee ownership into the way the company operates. There's also the increase in effort, flexibility, resilience on the part of the workers if they're now all owners. And that's what makes the company more efficient, and in part funds the company contribution to the ESOP as well as tax breaks. So it's the same general idea as a leveraged buyout, except that the workers end up being the beneficiaries instead of a private equity firm or what were just called leveraged buyout firms in the 1970s in the United States. The legislation was started in the 70s, and it was supported by both sides, by right and left wing. Bernie Sanders, for example, is a big supporter of ESOPs, as well as some of the more right-wing people in Congress. So that was an important characteristic. There was no sort of political ideology, and that's obviously important for Slovenia as well. And the ESOP was created by carving out a special type of pension plan. And so normally pension plans are forbidden to reinvest any of their funds above 6% or 10% in the employer. These are private pension plans, obviously, we're talking about, not government. So the ESOP was a carve out. It says, okay, if you register as an ESOP, you can reinvest 100% of your funds back in the employer company. And in fact, that's what you're supposed to do. It's not supposed to diversify outside. So the ESOP was, since it's a pension contribution, it's tax deductible, even though the money is just passing through the ESOP to pay off a loan or to pay off a note seller. There's no payroll taxes or in the American case, Social Security taxes on the ESOP contributions. And there's no tax incidence in the ESOPs. The ESOP doesn't have to pay income tax on this ESOP contribution as if it were revenue. Furthermore, if the owner sells to an ESOP, there are tax advantages for the owner. In particular, if they roll over the money they get from the company and selling their shares into other investments, then the capital gains tax is all deferred until you finally sell the other investments. So that's a whole set of tax benefits that have funded, as it were, the American ESOP. So the statistics are starting in the late 70s. There's about 7,000 ESOPs across the country, but the more impressive statistic is that 10% of the private workforce work in companies that have ESOPs. So when you compare that to the unionized, only 7% of the private workforce is unionized in the United States. So in 40 years, ESOPs have penetrated more into helping workers increase their income and their ownership than the union movement. And so that's obviously partly due to the fact that it's supported by both the left and the right. And in total, about 14 million employee ownerships. So the idea is not just to do the ESOPs as a piece of paper, but to do them as a way to bring workers into the whole culture of ownership, to become more entrepreneurial, more participative, consultative. And so it should always be accompanied by programs in the company that actually change the way the company operates, if it wasn't operating that way in the first place. So some companies are operating that way in the first place, and then they put an ESOP on top of it. So you're not just expecting workers to act like owners, they are becoming owners through the ESOP. And generally, the statistics are that ESOP companies are much more resilient, that when there are downturns, they readjust payroll and everything much more easily than a conventional company. And so they're more resilient in situations like the current crisis. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but the main source of ESOPs is really the smaller, medium-sized enterprise where you have a family ownership or a small number of founders and they want to exit. The family-owned company doesn't have, kids don't want to work in the company, take it over, and so what are they going to do? Who are they going to sell it to? So let's look over just the one scenario. I mean, there's a lot of different ways it can work out, but right now, the realistic thing in Slovenia is not to have a bank fund the ESOP or make a loan with the ESOP because it's so unknown. And it took a while in the United States for the banks to become familiar with it, but now most of your large banks and large consulting companies even have an ESOP department, so they know about it. But here we're starting much earlier stage. So most ESOPs would be funded by seller credit. So the ESOP issues a note to the seller, says, okay, this is in return for, say, 10% or 20% of your shares. And the note is guaranteed by the company. So the company is saying, we will make ESOP contributions to the ESOP. There'll be next slide, and then that will pay off the note. So company makes a guarantee, ESOP issues the note to the seller, and the seller puts the shares in the ESOP. So these shares are not individually allocated to workers at this time, because the whole point is the workers have to earn the shares over time by producing and paying for this ESOP contribution. So there is a special account, which in America is called the suspense account. So it's like the shares are suspended and are not individually owned. And then, as I have here in the next slide, as you make the ESOP contributions from the company to the ESOP, that the note payments pass right through to the seller, but it's at that time that the shares are individuated. So each time period, whenever you do it, say yearly, then the shares equal in value to the note payment are individualized into the workers' individual accounts in the ESOP. So that's where they really come into individual ownership, and the division between the accounts is typically according to salary. So sort of roughly, you're assuming that the employees' contribution to the company is roughly proportional to their salary, and so that's the split in the shares into the accounts. And then later on, eventually the ESOP will buy back the shares, and that's one thing that we're proposing is different in the Slovene ESOP than the American ESOP. In the American ESOP, it's a retirement plan, it's a pension plan, and so when a young worker, say in their 20s, comes in and says, oh, this is great, I'm getting shares, but when am I going to see any money? And they say, well, you'll see the money when you retire. And that just isn't real. I mean, young people want to buy an apartment or a car or whatever it is, and so they want to see some money in the near future. And so in the proposed legislation for Slovene ESOP, we're proposing what is called the rollover plan. So you buy back the shares after a certain period of time. In particular, after you pay off the note to the seller, then the ESOP contributions keep coming, but then you start buying out the oldest shares, the shares that were first put into the accounts. And so the workers that have been there longer will see some cash, and those shares are then redistributed to the existing workers according to salary, if that's your criteria. And when new workers come in, they automatically will get shares at that stage. When you're buying back, if the note's paid off, they'll get shares at that time. But if the note is already paid off, then when you start rolling over the shares, they will get them there. So new workers are automatically brought into ownership as this thing goes on. And once the shares go into the ESOP, in neither of these ways do the shares go outside the ESOP. So the ESOP creates sort of a permanent institution of ownership by the current employees at whatever percent that is. So it can start off at 20%, then if things are working out fine, it can build up, and of course, eventually to 100% if that's what the owners want. In America, there's somewhere between 500, 800 ESOPs that are 100%. So that can be the ending. So this is simply describing how the workers actually get shares. They don't get them originally. They go into this unindividuated suspense account, and only as the loan is paid off. So the workers are in effect creating this extra value, and then that pays off the loan, and that's when they get the shares into their account. And in the American ESOP, when employees leave or retire, then their account is closed and the shares are repurchased. So that's one of the things we propose to change, is don't require workers to exit or retire to get their money. They can get the money, start getting the money as soon as the initial note is paid off. But in either case, the repurchased shares are redistributed to the active employees. So the big picture here is that the ESOP is a permanent sort of ownership component to this company, keeping the ownership in the hands of the active employees, and that means keeping them in the hands of that community. So the capital, the jobs, the income, the taxes are all anchored in whatever community where the firm is located. Now, what are the options? Well, as I mentioned, most of the ESOPs in America arose out of succession problems. This was not something where if the company is failing, you sell it to the workers, because the ESOP depends on the company being viable, and the owners want to eventually reward their own employees, bring them into ownership. And so that's really been the source of almost all the ESOPs in the United States. The alternative is either to sell to a trade competitor, or in the United States at least, sell to a private equity firm. And you're getting private equity firms now in Europe as well. And we would argue that history shows this is not a good option if you want the company to remain in that community and the jobs and the income and everything else. Because let's say it's to a trade competitor, well, they don't want to run two separate businesses. They want the customer list. They want to take up your market share and eliminate that sort of competition. And they may take some of the top people out of the company, but they're not going to reinvest in the company as normal. The company has to replace its depreciated capital. Instead, they'll move the business and make investments in their original company. That's perfectly natural. And even if the trade competitor is a Slovene company, it's certainly the case if the buyer is not even Slovene. So that is generally not an option. But I will say, if you sell to a trade competitor or a private equity firm, you'll probably get more cash. Because when they value the firm, they value it from a strategic point of view. It's not just it's a standalone company. It's something where I can get a bigger share of the market. So they use a strategic valuation, not a normal financial valuation. And so companies will generally get more money, but then 5 or 8 years later, the company is shut down. And this is particularly not good for a family company to say, well, we got our money, but we're going to sell it in such a way that it gets shut down a few years into the future. So that's just not a good legacy. So that's why ESOPs have really caught on in America to address this succession problem. This is right now a very big problem in Western Europe, because so many companies in Western Europe, SMEs, started after World War II. And so the owners are already halfway out the door. And in Slovenia, a lot of the companies were started up in 1990. And so they're looking about the succession problem, 10 or 15 years off in the future. But now is the time to start doing something that ESOP takes time. You can't suddenly do something when you want to retire. You got to do it 10 years or so ahead of time so that the ESOP can build up ownership in the company. So the big picture here is the ESOP is really like a new social contract between the firm and the workers, that it changes the whole division between people who are owners and people who are just employees. So there is the ownership and employment in the company become the same thing. They're not risking their personal assets in doing this. It's something that depends on the company being profitable or becoming more profitable. And as I mentioned, the ESOP contributions, you get increased productivity because now you have a company of owners and you have to make corresponding changes in the company so that it really works as a company of owners, that workers, blue-collar workers' suggestions are listened to, they're respected because they're also co-owners and partners in the enterprise. There are tax benefits in the American case, and we're including tax benefits in the suggested Slovene ESOP. And then for the seller, there's all the non-monetary benefits that you're rewarding the workers and help build up the company. You're preserving the firm, not selling it in such a way that it'll be shut down in 5 or 8 years, and you're anchoring that capital, jobs, and taxes in the local community. So that's the sort of short version, the elevator version, as we say, of the American ESOP and some of the ways in which we hope to improve upon the American model in Slovenia. So this is the website of the Institute here, and in America there are already three national organizations to support ESOPs, and what I would really recommend is this National Center for Employee Ownership in Oakland, California. They have a wonderful website, blog. They have a monthly newsletter you can subscribe to for free, and they have all sorts of written material, and which one can buy, or some of it is free. And lastly here, this is one of the better blogs, Employee Owned America, that sort of keeps up on what's happening. So both these blogs here keep one up on the latest news with employee ownership. So that's the short version of my talk, and we have a good bit of time left here for questions and discussion and going into whatever sort of details you want to